The United States has laid out the conditions it expects Canada to meet during the review of their key free trade deal. Conditions the U.S. Trade Representative says must be met in order to keep CUSMA for the long term. CBC's JP Tasker has more on this from Washington. Good evening, JP. What is the Trump administration saying it wants to see from Canada?
Yeah, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer is laying out publicly for the first time what the administration wants Canada to do to keep CUSMA for the long term. And a lot of it comes down to booze, milk, and cheese. The ongoing provincial ban on American liquor has really hit a nerve here in Washington. American liquor sales in Canada have plummeted, as you know. They're down 60 to 70%. That blockade has been hugely impactful, and the Americans are now demanding some relief. Greer wants to see that boycott lifted before the U.S. agrees to renew CUSMA when it comes up for a review next year. That's not all he wants, of course. He's also calling for changes to Canada's supply management system that protects the domestic dairy industry. That has been a long-time irritant for the president. Canada has made clear, dismantling it in its entirety is a non-starter, but maybe there could be tweaks to how some of the tariffs, the tariff quotas, as they're called, are allocated. Greer is not prescriptive in the letter that he released to Congress yesterday, but he does want to see some changes to supply management. He made clear that the administration is expecting more tariff-free access for U.S. dairy products. Greer is also taking aim at the Online Streaming Act and the Online News Act. Of course, those Trudeau-era laws that American tech giants really don't like. The administration is calling them discriminatory. And lastly, Greer wants to make some changes to make it easier for American companies to bid on procurement projects. There's been some provinces that have thrown up some barriers in recent months since Trump went ahead with his tariffs. They want to see those gone. So the good news for Canada is that none of these are surprising. None of these demands are going to catch anybody off guard. Trump's been griping about dairy imports for a decade or more. And the list of must-dos to get a possible deal, to get a renewal, isn't that long. So there's some relief across industry and labor groups today that these demands are at least now out in the open. They know what they're working with, but still it could be a long and drawn-out process to re-up a trade deal that is so critical to our economy.
Well, yeah, and so what do we look for next as this review is approaching?
Yeah, the CUSMA review will kick off in earnest in the new year. Trump, Carney, and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum and their officials will hash things out. If this process goes well and the trade deal is renewed, then it will be in place for another 16 years. If things go sideways, the deal doesn't necessarily go away, but it will revert to yearly reviews, something Canada is eager to avoid given there would be a lot of annual uncertainty, and that's just bad for business. Sources tell us this could get messy. With Trump, you just never know how things are going to go, and there's almost, certainly going to be some changes. The Americans want a resolution to those issues I just described. That could take a lot of negotiation. And Jamieson Greer told Congress this week, I don't think we can say that USMCA is an unqualified success. The shortcomings are such that a rubber stamp of the agreement is not in the national interest. So obviously, Trump will not sign off on the status quo. We're not going to get a carbon copy of the existing trilateral pact. One thing is for sure, though, Canada wants to see the deal renewed, and they are eager to get the U.S. to lift those punishing tariffs on key sectors like steel, aluminum, lumber, autos. There's nothing in here from Greer about those so-called Section 232 tariffs. That could also be a source of tension in the coming months. Karina?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, JP. The CBC's JP Tasker in Washington. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Mark Carney is raising the stakes for a CUSMA renewal, saying it's now unlikely Canada will get another deal to lower U.S. tariffs. Today, reporters asked Carney if sector-specific tariffs would be lower if Ontario hadn't released an ad that angered the president.
It was the case that we were close to an agreement. We didn't get that agreement. My judgment is that is now going to roll into the broader CUSMA negotiations. So we're unlikely, given the time horizons coming together, to have a sectoral agreement.
Laura Dawson is the executive director of the Future Borders Coalition. Welcome to the show. Now, Mark Carney says it's unlikely Canada gets a near-term deal on sectoral tariffs like steel and autos. What does it mean for North American trade that those tariffs are likely going to be staying for the length of this CUSMA review?
It's quite unfortunate if you're in that sector or you're related to those sectors. It means that the economic pain associated with those tariffs will continue, what we call those 232 tariffs that are on a separate track from regular CUSMA trade. And so that relief from those tariffs is going to have to come through some sort of parallel negotiation that takes place with the United States. Ideally, we wanted to close that off before going into the CUSMA review in the summer. Doesn't seem like we were able to do that, and so folks in those affected sectors are just going to have to figure out a way to hang on.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like that's the easiest thing to have to hear if you're in that sector. Now, we did hear from the U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer in terms of when he was speaking to Congress, what the U.S. is looking for from Canada to some extent, acknowledging that there was broad support, though, at the CUSMA hearings that they had, and I believe you were also there. He did say that virtually all stakeholders want changes. How does that align with what you heard when you were there?
Yeah, I'm encouraged by the US process. It's a very transparent process in which they are legally required to hold certain hearings, publish certain reports, make certain statements and recommendations before the review. And so that's really helpful for us on the sidelines to try to figure out where folks are going next. He didn't use in Jamieson Greer's report, he didn't use any overly enthusiastic language. He said the agreement has been successful to a certain degree. But when you read deeper into his statement, it's all about ways that we can constructively improve the agreement, irritants to be fixed. There are certain areas where Canada's economic issues are definitely in the crosshairs, but for the most part, it looks like an agreement that the U.S. is committed to improving, not abandoning, not scrapping, not walking away from. So that's a small victory.
And that does align with what we heard from Mark Carney today to some extent, although, as you mentioned, there are some issues that they've outlined that are in, as you put it, the crosshairs of the U.S. His Greer statement included a list of issues that are both with Canada and Mexico. And he said the CUSMA review will depend on those issues getting resolved. How much should that alarm Canadian negotiators that we see what this is on that list, and so we kind of know what's ahead of us?
I don't think Canadian negotiators should be alarmed. Canadian negotiators are very agile, and they're talking to these particular sectors to see if there might be any room to move or modernize access in certain areas. At the same time, there's lots of positive areas for working together that are outlined in the agreement. For example, on critical minerals, on reducing being a backdoor to China, offshore access to the American market, control over fentanyl and other drugs. So there's areas in the security and new development areas that Canada can work with the United States on something like the Online Streaming Act. I think there's some room to maneuver there where Canada can get the policy outcomes that it needs in the online area without necessarily putting itself offside in the trade picture.
But one sector that might be feeling some alarm is the dairy sector, because there has been repeatedly raised, and Greer did it again, saying that the U.S. wants greater access to the dairy sector, even though, of course, it's supply managed, and we have a bill that protects legislation that protects the supply management system that Parliament passed. Carney today said it's not on the table. So how much of a wedge issue could that be going forward?
Well, it's a highly complex sector with all sorts of rules. And the US and Canada go back and have historically, gone back and forth on that sector for years and years. And as the production and supply chains change, as market access issues change, I think that there is some room to give the United States some of the market access that it's looking for, or more effective market access. Apparently, they're not using all that's been available to them for various reasons. So by upgrading and collaborating on a more effective market access arrangement, it may be possible to also maintain the supply managed protections that Canada has committed to.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because I think in terms of effective access, from what we understand from the U.S. dairy side, the reason that those quotas have not been reached, and just to remind our viewers that if a quota is reached, then those huge tariffs go on U.S. dairy because they're not getting to those quotas. They haven't had to actually face those 200% tariffs. But from what we understand, part of the problem is that the people who have access to those quotas, the companies that have access to those quotas, aren't necessarily the ones most interested in bringing in U.S. dairy, and they want it more spread over, for example, retailers. If we could change it like that without actually dismantling supply management, but giving the U.S. access like that, is that an area for compromise? And would that be distressing to the Canadian dairy industry, or would they be willing to make that compromise, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak on behalf of the Canadian dairy industry, but when I speak to agricultural economists in Canada, they point to all sorts of areas where modifications and improvements could be made, but it requires real nuanced conversation. The worst thing that can happen is some politicians standing up, in front of the issue like a freight train and saying, "Don't touch, no change, not ever," because that's not helpful to anyone.
Okay, so we'll have to, I guess, wait and see on that and whether that actually hits the table in that fashion. Greer also repeats the idea of separate talks with Canada, separate talks with Mexico to address the irritants that they have with both countries. Why has the U.S. continued to put so much focus on bilateral negotiations?
I think when you look at Greer's statement, you'll see that many of the issues that are identified have a lot more to do with Mexico than to do with Canada, especially things like labor and rules of origin and certain, mechanisms that are put in place for dispute settlement. And so, in some ways, from a practical standpoint, it makes sense for the U.S. to have conversations with Mexico separately and to deal with Canada separately on other things that are higher on the Canadian agenda, like things like critical minerals. But what Canada wants to avoid as a relatively small economy compared to the United States is being shunted off to the kids' table and then not invited back. This happened to us during the last USMCA negotiations where the talks splintered and Canada had a hard time getting back to the trilateral table. So it's okay to be discussing issues on a bilateral basis if there isn't strong trilateral interest in it, but the agreement as a whole has to be maintained as a trilateral agreement. Otherwise, it doesn't break down into two bilaterals. It's actually three bilaterals. Canada would have to form a separate agreement with Mexico, which it doesn't currently have. That agreement is part of the trilateral USMCA, NAFTA, CUSMA.
Yeah, there's many names for it. We have to keep explaining it to people. We'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. Prime Minister Mark Carney says dropping supply management is not on the table. This came up when asked about irritants headed into trade talks with the U.S. and Mexico.
We have discussions. It's a negotiation. Each side has a set of issues. They put those issues on the table. They're measured in the dozens of issues. The U.S. has 54 issues with Mexico, for example. So when they're referenced, you have to put that in the context.
U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer told Congress yesterday that the trade pact between the three countries has been successful to a certain degree. This came with the warning that certain irritants must be gone before extending. These include supply management and the Online Streaming Act. We're joined now by someone who has some insight into the president's mind on trade. Everett Eisenstadt was the deputy director of the U.S. National Economic Council and former deputy assistant to President Trump for international economic affairs. He's a partner at Squire Patton Boggs. Welcome to the show. Thanks very much for joining us. Now, as we've been talking about on the show, U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer told Congress that CUSMA has been successful to a certain degree. What's your sense of how strongly this administration wants to keep the pact or not?
Yeah, it's a great place to start. I think there's, obviously they'd like to keep the pact together if it's able to achieve their objectives. I think one of the biggest concerns is, and you heard this from Ambassador Greer. Right now, they feel that it's not working the way the president's trade policies are focused. So in that sense, if the pieces can come together, I am confident they would like to continue this pact. But right now, we're hearing all kinds of mixed signals about the viability of this. There's even talk of will the president withdraw? Will the review continue for many, many years? Will it just be a rollover, or will there actually be, a point in time at which the three parties come together and say, okay, this is it. We got the deal, we're done, and we can move forward, and we're happy with this agreement. I think that's a long way off from now. So there's a lot of work to be done. This year is going to be, well, actually, we're headed into 2026. It's going to be a really important year for the relationship, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of opportunity for conversations between the two governments.
Now, this list from Greer was sort of the first glimpse into what the president might be looking for in these talks, or at least the first glimpse on paper of sorts. What did you make of the list? Did you expect to hear more? Is it what you expected? Is it just the start?
It's part of a list that's been in perpetuity for literally dozens of years. I mean, some of these issues have been around for decades. Now, the Online Streaming Act is somewhat new, but the concerns over digital platforms is not just with Canada; it's a global concern. There were concerns expressed about this law. There's concerns expressed about discrimination against the U.S. Digital companies. That is widespread. It's not something the administration is going to just stand up and look the other way. And same with supply management and the access to the dairy market. That's been something that has been on the plate now for many decades. As you may recall, I was the assistant U.S. trade representative for many years under President Obama and President Bush, and this was an issue at that time. And the fact that you go through a USMCA review, it's still an issue. Something needs to be done. I think the patience is fairly limited on that.
Now, when, of course, the Prime Minister was asked about the list today, and he said that the issues are measured in the dozens, and he, as we heard in a clip there, pointed to 54 issues that the U.S. Reportedly has with Mexico. How likely is it that bilateral deals could emerge from this process?
I think it's very possible. Obviously the agreement started out bilaterally. It moved into a trilateral agreement. The United States does not have that many plurilateral agreements. In that sense, the USMCA or the CUSMA is a very unique agreement. I think even the fact that they said, well, there's 12 issues here, there's 54 with Mexico, it shows that the relationships are very different. And there needs to be a way to manage those. And the administration may ultimately decide that it's in the U.S. interest to manage those bilaterally. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. But it's certainly on the table, and it's something that's been talked about, frequently here in Washington.
Could we have bilateral deals within a trilateral deal? Is that possible?
I think so. I mean, in my mind, you can, but I can conceptualize it and I can visualize it, but then you have to actually do the legal framework for it and operationalize it. Yeah, I think you possibly could do that. It certainly wouldn't be, it'd be very different than what we have, but I think it's very possible.
Now, last time you were on this program, you said you thought the president would be reluctant to drop the counter tariff. Do you see any runway where these sectoral tariffs could be lowered or dropped through this review process?
Well, I'm glad I've got to come back because it's been such an interesting dynamic. The president has not given any indication that he is going to move on sectoral tariffs with any country. Now, there were some lower tariffs negotiated, tariff rates with countries with framework agreements. But even there, we have not seen anything lower than 10%. What we are seeing is a little bit of flexibility within those. And so in many ways, it's getting much more granular as to how they're being implemented. Like the general framework continues to exist, but within that framework, there are flexibilities built in that give more space for parties to deal with under it. But I don't see moving away with just like a complete exemption on these is really on the table right now, particularly for steel and aluminum.
Now, you mentioned dairy as being a long-term a long time irritant. And Greer told Congress that Canada has policies that unfairly restrict market access of certain dairy products. From your understanding of this administration, do you think the president wants it gone outright? Is there, in terms of supply management, or is there a middle ground that could be reached in terms of increasing market access without abolishing a system that politically would be very difficult for Canada to get rid of?
Look, we defer to the negotiators as to how to solve this problem. But one of the things that has been very clear in the negotiations with the president has initiated this year is 3 elements to it. One, additional market access and reduction of non-tariff barriers for U.S. products, investment commitments, and transactional purchases. So look, however you put those together, I think it's the package that's important. Whether that has to be a complete restructuring of the system, I defer to the negotiators. I'm sure that there are creative ways to do that. The key is wanting to get to yes. And one of the things that concerns me a little bit is it doesn't seem to be a lot of impetus to really move on some of these issues that have clearly been stated to be clear priorities for the United States. And that's fine. Nobody has to move on anything. But if there's not any movement, there's not going to be an agreement. And I think that's something that needs to be understood. I recall, and I wanted to tell this story because I think it's important. When I first started to work with the president at the G20 negotiations in Hamburg, Germany, and I sat down, as his negotiator, one thing that really resonated with me is that one of my one of my administration counterparts said, look, you don't have to get to yes. We're fine with no. And having been at the table as a negotiator before, when you have a principle that says, look, you do your best, but you get what we need, and I'm happy to walk away if you don't. I got your back. I mean, that is something that I think is really important to digest and understand, that getting to yes is not the goal. Getting the outcome is the goal. And I do believe this president would walk away if he is not able to achieve what he sets out to do.
Isn't that the key with any negotiation, though, the willingness to walk away?
Not really. I mean, I've been at many, I've negotiated a lot of trade agreements, and there's often other contingencies, right? There's particularly in international negotiations where you've got foreign policy concerns and defense concerns and all these other equities that kind of put pressure on a trade negotiator to come to an agreement. Here, trade is the deal, right? These other considerations, they'll manage them. But for this president, trade is the number one deal. And he is not going to be pressured by geographic proximity or the foreign policy concerns to come to an agreement on trade that he does not feel is adequate. I think that's a very significant difference, and it's one that I personally felt as being part of his team in the first Trump administration.
Well, I really appreciate your insights today. Thank you for coming back on the show.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
That's former Deputy Assistant to President Trump, Everett Eisenstadt.